Lenin has several strokes and then dies. And it's not the NEP goes to the discussions between the left opposition, which includes Trotsky and I believe at this point Zinoviev, and the rest of the party, which is Stalin and Bukharin and the rest of the party leadership. And so with this, Lenin dies and leaves it to his successors, which if you have questions about Stalin and this period after, I would again recommend our lecture on Stalinism for some aspect of that. But what I'm going to deal with now is Leninism. And I'm going to deal with it theoretically. And I'm also going to deal with it both, one, in his context, and I believe with a strong emphasis on Leninism for our context. So what are the similarities between Lenin's context and our context? As I see it, there are two. The first is when Lenin is writing, beginning his career with what is to be done, and as John pointed out, the numerous party congresses, there is a lack of revolutionary organization. They are basically starting from scratch. They have nothing. And so one of the questions that they're dealing with is, how are we to organize a revolutionary party to essentially overthrow capitalism? Now, of course, in the United States, we had the 60s where there were a bunch of parties, and how revolutionary they are depends on how sympathetic you're feeling. But we don't have that now, right? The most active and probably powerful communist party is the Party for Socialism and Liberation, and it's an isolated party that is mostly on the West and East Coasts. So the situation that confronts us is we do not have a revolutionary party or a revolutionary organization. So that's the first similarity. And the second similarity is this. Lenin was besieged by unorthodoxy. An orthodoxy about how a revolution could be made, what was possible and what was impossible. And this orthodoxy told him that you should not organize your party centrally and with discipline. It is not necessary to have a revolutionary vanguard. It is not necessary to engage in political and revolutionary struggles because economic struggles are enough. And Lenin was a radical break. He was a break from all of these ideologies and these theories, but he was also a radical break from the men and the communists who supported these, Plekhanov and Karl Kautsky. Right now, we live in an orthodoxy. And again, we're a non-tendency organization, but I'm going to argue this as a Marxist-Leninist. So I want to be clear, this is my position. We live in an orthodoxy. And our orthodoxy is ultra-leftism. And it can go by autonomia, it can go by the name, or anarchism, or crime-think, or any number of organizations, or at this point, they're not even organizations. They're loose-knit conceptual ideas. And we live in an orthodoxy of spontaneity, that any organization is inherently alienating and hierarchical and will lead to counter-revolution. And anyone who talks about organization or discipline or truth or right or the organization of workers both politically and economically in an organization with rules and strictures and discipline is essentially an outcast. And so today, the radical new idea, if I can be permitted to call it new, is itself Leninism, against all the new leftists who are now old and tired. So in this case, right, my lecture on Leninism is going to focus theoretically, because I can't focus on everything, on these aspects that make Leninism timely to us today. So with that, Lenin remains one of the most important and prolific writers in history. One must always run into difficulties condensing the thought of a great thinker into a single lecture. However, I believe I can address Leninism with three main theoretical contributions, again relevant to our time. First, Lenin added to Marxism the notion of imperialism and labor aristocracy. Second, he argued for the theoretically advanced revolutionary vanguard as the nucleus of revolution. Finally and relatedly, he viewed the state as necessary and linked to his theories of the revolutionary vanguard. And again, the state as a means of one class oppressing another. And I'll get into more detail of this. And again, however, one should always understand Lenin's polemics as primarily focused at his opponents of the day, namely the opportunists, the economists, and the revisionists. So, Lenin's theory of imperialism aimed to explain why workers in developed nations often refuse to support the revolutionary struggle. Under Marx's conception, capitalism expands its exploitation to the workers. This puts the workers directly in conflict with their capitalist oppressors. However, at the turn of the 20th century, European powers began colonizing Africa and Asia. These imperialist powers began exploiting not just their resources, but also the local workers to make products for them. By forcing these imperial colonies to accept foreign capital, right, that's capital from the imperialist nations, they could continue to exploit the local population while ostensibly only using local companies, right? So the profits of all this labor would accumulate to the more advanced capitalist countries. And the excess of profits allowed for the capitalist countries to pay certain skilled workers a higher wage than those workers, than other workers in their nation or around the world, right? These key specific jobs like skilled factory worker could be paid a little bit more to sort of diffuse the tensions, right? So these workers who receive an extra cut of the imperialist profits are the labor aristocracy. And the labor aristocracy forms itself, again, out of the workers who gain the biggest return from capitalist imperialists to keep the peace in more developed capitalist countries. They become satisfied with their position, and when they do engage in struggles, they only struggle for themselves. They abandon universal class struggle for their own very narrow economic interests. And of course, we can see this today in the relatively high-paid union members who still buy cheap products from China. But of course, right, they refuse to fight for the unionization of other workers. So it's the job of revolutionaries to break the labor aristocracy in favor of workers as a universal class and to oppose imperialism wherever it raises its head. However, the core of Leninism, right, as a revolutionary theory, lies in his notion of revolution and state, or the party and the state. So Lenin reacted very strongly to a trend in Marxism occurring at this time, that I mentioned briefly earlier, that many refused to see the goal of communism as a long, drawn-out class struggle between workers and revolutionary organizations on one hand and the capitalists on the other hand. Instead, they thought that some opportunity would present itself so they could avoid the long struggle and bring about a revolution immediately. So, in this case, this term became known as opportunism, right? And its supporters would be opportunists because they were waiting for an opportunity to act on that. Now, one branch of opportunism seeks to organize the workers in economic struggles and focus simply on the day-to-day without worrying about raising their consciousness. So this term became known as economism, and their supporters as economists. Finally, these economists only wish to focus on getting people into trade unions, what we would just call unions, and were unsurprisingly called trade unionists. And this was only the most dominant form of opportunism, but there were others. The anarchists and the agrarian socialists, as John mentioned, practiced another form of opportunism, and that was terror. They believed that terror could shake people from their slumber. However, Lenin, even if he issued some sympathetic remarks, viewed them as either a symptom of poorly organized revolutionary groups or an attempt to shortcut the difficult task of revolution by engaging in these hopeless, futile, perhaps, if you're sympathetic, heroic acts.